Okay, so welcome. Good morning, everyone. My name's Kira, for any of you that aren't familiar with me. And this is just a stress bucket. It's called the stress bucket. So before we jump into that, I'm going to just quickly introduce myself properly. Oh, what have I done? Okay, so in my sort of day job, my title is a health and wellbeing expert. That means that I do things like this, actually, a lot of webinars, predominantly to government agencies, a lot of HMRC, DWP, prisons, probation, all that sort of thing. I also conduct health assessments, so kind of like general sort of MOTs with blood pressure and BMI and taking bloods and things like that, and giving a lot of sort of general advice to people dependent on whatever comes up during those consultations. I have a postgraduate diploma in personalized nutrition and a nutritional therapy practice diploma, so I'm a qualified therapist, yoga teacher as well, particularly specializing in yoga for the stages of menopause, but also pregnancy and postnatal yoga. I run sessions for stages of menopause and pregnancy yoga weekly. I'm hoping to add postnatal in the next month or so, hopefully. And what I'm also hoping to build up is a health and wellbeing coaching business as well on the side, specifically looking at or tailoring again the women within the stages of menopause. So not medical support, as that's not my area, but just general health and wellbeing coaching. And Loki's favorite person to cuddle with, although since I wrote that, he has definitely started favouring my partner. So that might be a little bit of a fib now. Or he'll change his mind tonight, who knows. So what we're going to look at today is mostly looking around stress. Stress is a big part, I think, of modern day life. And a lot of it kind of just is normalised, like all the sort of side effects we're going to have a look at in a minute. We might look at them and you think, well, yeah, well, that's just normal. But I mean, it shouldn't be, but unfortunately it kind of is. So knowing what some of the common signs and symptoms are, and in particular your ones as well, can be really helpful to help you notice when, like a red flag, ultimately, things aren't as they should be. And a couple of little tools, little activities to help to manage stress, if you find them useful. Obviously, everyone's going to be slightly different and have a different approach to these sorts of things. So firstly, kind of what is stress? Stress is defined as being the adverse reactions people have to the excessive pressures or demands that are placed on them. So, I mean, an amount of stress is good, all right? Not all stress is bad, as it says on the slide. Like, we need a certain amount of pressure to get us going. So, for example, if we, rocked up to work and there were no deadlines, no meetings, no nothing like that, we didn't have any responsibilities, any pressures in that sense, we'd probably all become quite idle people quite quickly. So we do need an amount of stress to motivate us. Equally, things like exercise, that's a stress on the body, but it's a good, healthy stress, a stress that's making us stronger. Things that push us outside of our comfort zone can help us to grow. So those, to some extent, those stresses are really good for us, provided we don't go too far. Again, there's always going to be that sort of tipping point. And again, as it says on the slide here, each of us have an individual tipping point, from the sort of perfect amount of stress that keeps us going and motivates us to too much. It can be quite a fine line depending on you, the day, how much coffee you've had, how much sleep you had, what the weather's like, who's around annoying you, like there's so many different factors that can impact on our stress. And being individuals, we've all got very different perspectives on situations. We could all be subjected to the same kind of stress-inducing event or situation and come away from it with very different experiences, because, I mean, ultimately, because we're different people, we've all got different backgrounds and cultures and health statuses and skills and experiences and all those sorts of things. And all of that impacts on how we experience stress. So looking at kind of what stress is from a physiological and a psychological perspective, because it isn't just feeling stressed, when we're just feeling a bit overwhelmed and a bit hectic. It's actually a physical response within the body, and it's all governed by our limbic system, which is a real sort of primitive part of our brain, our animal brain. It's often referred to. It's what, like, the earliest bit of us really that was developed, and it's what we're looking at specifically here is the autonomic nervous system, which governs either our fight, flight, or freeze response or our rested state. And there, I think the best way to kind of think about those two is two sides of a coin. You're either in one or the other. You can't kind of have a foot in both. So when we're talking about bringing balance to the autonomic nervous system, what we're actually referring to, or what we mean more specifically, is spending most of our time in a rested state and then accessing that sympathetic nervous system, that fight or flight, at the appropriate times. So as I said, it's both a psychological and a physiological experience for the body. And what we've got listed here on this slide are the more physiological aspects of it. So if we think about it from an evolutionary perspective, ultimately our bodies have not adapted, as much as the environment around us has changed. So we're still very basic, quite primitive when it comes to our programming in this sense. So we've got our sympathetic nervous system, our fight, flight, freeze. This is our inbuilt survival mechanism. So when our body feels or registers something in our environment that is not safe for us. So again, historically, we're probably talking like a saber-toothed tiger or something like that. Modern day living, it's less likely to be something as imminently life-threatening as that. It's more likely to be things like, again, deadlines, financial worries, over commitment to things, those sorts of things. And we get our sympathetic nervous system goes into kind of overdrive ultimately. And when this happens, certain systems are upregulated and certain systems are downregulated. So for example, we get an increase in cortisol and adrenaline, higher heart rate, higher blood pressure, an increase of blood sugar. Because this blood sugar is stored all around our body precisely for times like this, really. It's that excess energy we've got stored ready for when we need it. So it's all released into our bloodstream, so that it can be pumped into the systems and the muscles and the organs and whatever that we need in that moment to get us out of a dangerous situation. It can tense our muscles, as like we're primed for action, we're on high alert in this state. And the systems typically that tend to get reduced are things like our digestive systems, our immune systems, our reproductive systems, even our cognitive functioning. If we're face to face with a saber-toothed tiger, we do not need to be digesting our lunch or fighting off a cold. We need to get out of that situation. And therefore the body prioritizes its energy as efficiently as it can for that imminent danger situation. The opposite of that, our parasympathetic nervous system, our rest and digest state, is essentially that everything's just sort of working in harmony. Nothing's upregulated, nothing's downregulated. It's all just working as it should. And as I'm sure you can appreciate, both of those are very efficient ways for the body to work, but only one of them is efficient for long-term kind of use. You think a little bit like a car, when you're pulling out of a junction, you need that fast go and you're in first gear. But if you stayed in first gear for the rest of your journey, that's going to do probably some damage to your car. You're going to burn through that fuel probably a lot quicker than if you were in the right gear. And it's a similar sort of principle here. Like, we need that fight or flight kind of response to get us out of situations where we need them. But the rest of the time, the body needs that balance. If anyone's got any questions, by the way, please do jump in. You can see the chat, so I can have a quick look. I'm going to get you guys interacting a little bit in a moment. So with this in mind, hopefully some of these kind of signs and symptoms of stress might make a little bit more sense. They might be things perhaps that you've noticed in yourself previously, and maybe not attributed to stress, or known perhaps that it's because you're stressed, but not really understood the link between the two. So for example, cognitive functioning. So what I was saying a moment ago, when we're in a state of stress, that cognitive functioning is actually decreased. Like, we don't need to waste energy rationalizing a situation when we're in a life-threatening position. Like, we need to get out of that situation. Our emotional things, so like moodiness, irritability, agitation, feeling overwhelmed, sense of loneliness. Again, those things aren't balanced. None of our systems are working as efficiently or as harmoniously as they could be. And again, one of those things being our cognitive functioning. So I mean, our emotions are very much kind of a primitive part again of how we work, but the way in which we rationalize them is what kind of helps us get through day to day. Those physical signs and symptoms, I feel like they make much more sense when we appreciate that stress physically impacts us. So it makes sense that we have aches and pains in our muscles and joints if we're primed to attack, you know, if we're like those runners on the starting blocks ready to go. Diarrhea, constipation, nausea, you know, changes to eating habits and appetites, and those sorts of things all make sense when our digestive systems aren't working as well as they could be. Frequent colds and illnesses, you know, again, makes sense if our immune system is being downregulated. So again, like you might notice some of these things, you're like, yeah, that's definitely me, or maybe you recognize them in other people. You're like, yeah, I can definitely tell when my partner's stressed out because these are like their tells. But just wanted to highlight, and equally, everyone's completely different. So you might look at that list and say, no, that's not what happened. Like, that's not how I recognize stress. It's very different for me. And that's, you know, that's absolutely fine. So I've got an activity now for you all to do. Hopefully you've all got a pen and paper. I forgot to remind you to grab one of them at the beginning. I would like you to draw yourself a bucket. Doesn't have to be particularly artistic. You are the only ones that can see it. Literally just a U shape will do. And spend a moment now thinking about the stressors from your day to day. So, oh, and what I forgot to clarify. So we've got stress and stressors, and they are slightly different in the sense that stress is more of that feeling, that physiological kind of sense. The stresses are just the things, you know, the things on your to-do list, the things that make up your day to day, the things you just have to get done, the things that are on your mind. Maybe none of them individually is particularly stressful or overwhelming, but it's that combination of things, you know, almost like a game of Buckaroo. You know, you were just adding stresses to the load, and eventually it can overflow. So have a moment, just think about things, even you know, if there's been a handful of things this morning that have impacted on you. It could be anything from, you know, like global warming to not having enough milk for your coffee this morning, you know, whatever it is along that spectrum. Sorry, I'm just going to close my blinds, the sun's blinding me. Okay. Oh, brilliant. Yes, so Jen's saying cooking is definitely a stressor. Nicola, not enough time in the day. Yeah, I think that's quite a common one. I'm just going to read out the comments so people on the when they're watching back get an idea of what you guys are sharing. Can also be things in there that, again, are not necessarily bad things, but they are just a thing, you know. Usually when I do this with big groups, more than one person will list children in that thing, and that's not to say, you know, they're not a bad thing. It is, you know, it's just more tasks, isn't it? More things to have to think about, more headspace being taken up. Trying to get ready for work with my daughter wanting your attention. Yeah, Jen, I can imagine it's just juggling, isn't it? Everything seems to take long, you know. I mean, don't have kids. I've got a puppy, as you've seen. Even with him, you know, just getting out of the house, just getting past him to physically get out of the house takes longer than if he wasn't there.
I think I've just listed this is my life. As in, everything in itself can be a real positive, but all the elements can add to stress. So I've written, like, for Jen, I've written cooking. Like, again, I find that a real, like, head fuck, to put it bluntly, in that you've got to plan ahead. Like, oh my god, the children need feeding again, kind of thing. So everything I've written down is kind of my entire life. Is that bad?
Yeah. So sometimes it can be described as, you know, just general adulting, you know.
Yeah, no, definitely. Adult. And I think the generation I'm in now, I've got the people below me, as in my children, the people on level with me, as in my friends and my, like, husband, and then people above me, like my parents and my mother-in-law. So you're kind of supporting three tiers, and then somehow yourself in there too. So I think there's an awful lot of emotional pulls on people these days, or maybe always, but right now I feel it.
And
sandwich generation.
It's a bit of a circle as well, because I like to eat healthily, but if I actually do proper cooking from scratch, there's lots more mess to clear up, and I'm trying to do it when Mabel's like at my feet shouting things. And our kitchen's quite small, and it's like, it's the environment's not ideal, and then the subsequent like clearing up that needs to be done, it's like, oh
for me it's like, it's all the shopping as well. It's like meal planning, then going shopping, then unloading the shopping, and then like putting it all it's like
and then being like, have we got orange juice? I'm like, I don't know, have we? And then we don't, and you're like, oh, I need to buy that, and you've got this constant mental shopping list in your head as well.
I
don't know if anyone else has
so
that. Definitely.
I mean, thinking about sticking with that metaphor, I guess, with the bucket, what happens if we just keep adding stressors to the bucket?
It overflows.
As well as emotion.
Overflow, 100%. And again, if we're thinking about that as a person, probably going to implode or explode at that point, I think, aren't you, when things just get a bit too much. So what can we do? We can add some taps, or we can add some holes. Any guesses what these might represent?
For me, it would be like going running, or taking some time to breathe properly, trying to put gaps in my life a little bit, so there's a tiny breathing space in between the stresses. But that's my personal response. Doesn't mean everyone else's.
No, perfect. Those are all great examples of coping mechanisms, and that's exactly what we're looking at here. And as Nicholas put in the chat, like letting things go, that's another great example there. So we've got two different taps, two different holes, representing two different types of coping mechanism ultimately. The helpful, and then the slightly less helpful ultimately. So previously I've done sessions where the materials kind of labeled these as good and bad, and I think that's too black and white. It's this it's, I think, more useful to think of them as helpful and unhelpful. So what we're looking at here, again, if any guesses, can anybody think of things that might fall into that more unhelpful category?
Overeating, drinking wine. Yeah,
exactly.
Things I do every day.
Ultimately it's those sorts of kind of instant gratification type things. So things that make you feel kind of instantly better in the moment, don't solve any of the problems, and could ultimately be adding more stress into the mix. So for example, like alcohol doesn't help with our sleep. It might help us fall asleep, but that quality of sleep is impacted. And if all of those stresses in your bucket are made worse or are more difficult to handle because you've not had a good night's sleep, then it's just adding more stress back into that bucket. Same with things like gambling, drugs, like overeating, impulse buying. All of those things might make you feel a bit better in the moment, but aren't gonna, they're just skimming off the top, aren't they? They're preventing it perhaps from overboiling in that moment, but are gonna add more in. Whereas those more helpful coping skills are things that are actually going to make a dent in that stress. So it might be just general stress reducers and or relaxation promoters, because ultimately they might be completely different activities for you, but they're going to reach the same kind of end goal here. So you're going to, because if we think back, stress and relaxation are the opposites. So we're either trying to reduce that stress or promote that relaxation. Same end goal, but perhaps different methods to do it. So as I said, general things. So like Linda was saying, like about going for a run, exercise is a time and time again being shown and proven to be a fantastic de-stressor. Those more higher energy activities, really great for burning off excess cortisol and adrenaline. The lower energy things, like yoga or Pilates or going for a walk, things like that, just really good for helping to promote relaxation and clearing the mind. But it might also be things like targeted help. So if you've got, I don't know, a medical issue or a hole in your roof, those are the sort of things you might want to get professional support with. There's also things that I feel might fit in both categories depending on the situation. The most obvious to me is, just having a bit of a rant about something, just getting it off your chest. If you've had an argument with your partner or a confrontational situation, and you just want to have a bit of a moan about it, that can be enough. You just have a moan, move on, feel much better. Again, if you've got a hole in your roof and all you're doing is sitting about moaning about it, that's only going to add to the stress ultimately. So really, it's about perhaps identifying those less helpful coping skills that you might have, whatever it is for you. Again, as I said, there's some classic examples, but everyone's going to have their own thing. But then also thinking about, what are my more helpful coping skills? What do I do fairly consistently to just generally keep stress levels sort of lower, or to help promote relaxation? But then what would be my targeted approaches to things? Again, if anybody's got any sort of examples of things they want to share, please do.
I think I already did. I thought I should let someone else share. I think something that I need to do more of is actually physically building time into my schedule, which is not full, if that makes sense. Because there's very little gaps in my life, and that's when I feel really overwhelmed, because I'm trying to squeeze but Nicola said before, squeeze too much in.
Yeah.
And so therefore you're always under pressure, and you quite often under deliver to yourself what you were hoped to do that day or that hour.
Yeah.
And so just like reducing the expectation perhaps, so that you don't add to the load. I don't know. I don't quite know how that looks yet, even for myself, but something I'm conscious of. I want to do something about.
It's good. And I think there's a lot of stuff, like we all know, if we had less demands on ourselves, probably more demanding of ourselves than anybody else is of us, that would make our life easier. Well, we know that. It's not always that easy in practice, but keep coming back to that and reminding yourself. Eventually it sort of changes the mindset around things, isn't it?
I think the other thing I was going to say is time versus energy. So like, I'll look at my diary and be like, I've got a slot there, but actually when you look at all the other things going on around it, like, have you got the energy to actually do it as well, if that makes sense? Which I'm trying to do more of, but I'm not very good at.
That makes a lot of sense.
Back-to-back meetings, and I'm like, I don't feel 1,000,000%, and it's just, you've sometimes got to think about things and say no to stuff beforehand.
I think it's looking at the bigger picture, isn't it? You're like, yes, I squeeze that thing in there, that's going to help me out, but like in that moment, but at what cost? You said, like, if I did that every day, how is that going to help me in the long run? Another thing to have a think about with the buckets, and I think this actually was mentioned in the Facebook group the other day, is about focusing on what you have control over. So I'm willing to bet there are very, very few things in your buckets that you have complete control over, and that you could just decide to get rid of. You're like, nah, I've had enough of that one. We'll get rid of that. It tends to be things that you don't have a great deal of control over that ultimately cause the most stress, but they're in that bucket because they're important. They make up your life, your lifestyles, your families, your work, whatever it may be. So then this can be a really useful tool, this circle of control. And there's a couple of ways in which you can use this. So ultimately what you're looking at is listing things within that middle circle that you have complete control over. Things that you can't control but you can influence, so like other people, or sleep. You can't completely control your sleep, but you can do things that help to promote better sleep. That would fall into that circle. And then this is where the sort of variation might come. So depending on how you work, sort of as how your brain works, you can either then choose to list all the other stuff that's outside of your control on the outside of that paper, if it works best for you to have that as a visual reminder that it's outside of the circle. Or you can choose not to put it in there. If it's not within your control and you can't influence it, it's not going on the paper, as a reminder that it doesn't fit into either of those circles. And if it's not on the paper, it's something, we have to deal with that a little bit differently. Again, as I said, depends on how your brain works as to which one of those approaches makes most sense to you. But this can, even if you don't physically write this out, it can be quite useful every now and again to just take a step back and go, right, is this within my control? No. Okay, can I influence any aspect of this to make it better or easier, or whatever. And if the answer to that one is no as well, you're like, okay, well, then we need to do something else. And more often than not, that something else, the best approach can be to have a bit of acceptance around the situation. And acceptance doesn't mean that you've given up. It doesn't mean that you agree with what's going on. A really good way, I think, to look at a perspective to have on acceptance is that it's, you choosing to use your energy more constructively or more proactively. So rather than wasting energy fighting against something that you don't have control over or you can't influence, you can take a step back and say, okay, I don't agree with it, I'm not happy with it, but there's nothing I can do about that situation. I'm going to channel my energy and my resources, my time, my money, whatever it is, into something that I can have some control over, or that will help me to make this situation a bit better. Even if it's booking a massage and or going to the cinema, something complete escapism. Perfect, do that. It's just one way of removing a lot of stress from your bucket, because it helps you to change the way you look at something ultimately, and that's it. It might sound really simple, but changing your perspective around a situation can remove an awful lot of stress from that bucket. So if we think about when we're stuck in a traffic jam, if we sat there getting really angry about it, being really frustrated, we're going to rock up wherever we're going in a terrible mood, probably, more often than not. Whereas if we kind of think, okay, well, yeah, this situation sucks, but there is literally nothing I can do about it. I'm just going to crank up the radio, sing along with my favorite songs, and I'll get there when I get there. You're going to arrive in a much better mood than as I said, sitting there seething about it. Okay, last little bit, just a quick activity that might be useful to some of you. So this is our stop technique. So it's a mindfulness-based technique that is simple and easy to use. It can help you build a clear picture of your emotions and help to increase your self-awareness. So the first bit, stop. So physically stop or mentally stop. If you're having one of those moments where you're just feeling completely overwhelmed and you're rushing around like a headless chicken, this is when I think this actually can be the most useful. But so in that moment, stopping for a moment, okay? Take a breath. So notice your breathing. Is it quicker and shallower than you would like? Taking several deep breaths. So if we think back to that parasympathetic and sympathetic response, our breathing rate is a really good indicator of whether or not we're in a stress response. And it's also one of the quickest and easiest ways to calm us as well during a situation. So if we can, and I probably don't need to be over explaining this to Linda, for example, my manager is well aware of this, but if we can slow our breathing, we can calm it, then we help to calm our nervous system. We help to promote those more feel-good brain chemicals and hormones. And we help to engage the rational part of our brain as well. So then we can observe. So turn your attention inwards. What are you physically experiencing? So maybe running through your senses, just perhaps to distract yourself. Or maybe it's more of okay, I'm really feeling some tension in my jaw or in my shoulders. I'm really feeling some knots in my stomach or something like that. Or just take your attention again completely externally and focus on something in your environment. Look out the window, look at a tree, notice the leaves moving, it's those sorts of things. So just take your mind off that situation for a moment. And then P is about putting it into perspective. So taking a hot air balloon view, what is the bigger picture? Or maybe thinking like, what would you say to a friend if they were in that situation? What would they say to you? Try and get a different perspective on that situation. And I'm sure you can appreciate relate to this, far more rational with other people's problems than we are with our own. So if we can put ourselves into that mindset, that can be really, really helpful. And maybe actually the best thing for you to do in that situation is to just park it, either thinking, can I choose to just let it go? And that may be the case. You can, in some situations, that will be relevant. But maybe you need to park it. So let's say, I don't know, there's some big changes coming up at work. They've just kind of dropped this bomb on you Friday afternoon. You don't know what it is, but you're going to have a meeting next week to get more information. rather than ruining your weekend with your head spinning out of control with all the possible, what could this mean? Every time you notice yourself going down that route, practicing this, stop it, and then saying, okay, we don't have enough information right now. We're going to come back to that when we have. And you might need to keep doing that, you know, you have to do it every half hour, but at least you're not allowing those thoughts to kind of get away with you. You might only need to do it once and your brain's like, okay, cool, we'll come back to that later. That's fine. I'm on board. Again, we're all very different, and it might be dependent on the situation as well. If anyone's got any questions or thoughts on that, please do share. But it's just,
I remember doing this before, but I've completely forgotten it. I love it. It's great.
oh, good.
I've written it all down.
So that's everything. I'm just going to quickly go to the last slide. Thank you guys for joining. Thanks everyone for watching back. As I said, I don't know if they caught this on the recording, but these are I want to do things like this sort of professionally, deliver these as sessions. So any feedback you've got on the styling, the content, anything like that, please do share, because that's all really, really helpful. So yeah, that's all from me. If anyone's got questions, please let me know.